At first, they thought he was just a lost kid. Maybe a neighbor's son who wandered too close. Maybe someone's nephew who didn't know better than to stand near a row of Harleys and hard men in black leather. But when he showed up at his 7th biker funeral, the club knew something wasn't right. Nobody said it out loud. Not yet. That's not how these men worked. You didn't speak a thing until you were sure of it, until it sat in your chest long enough to become real. But every single one of them had seen him, and not one of them could explain why. It was October, cold the way October gets in the Midwest, not winter yet, but winter's shadow already stretched across everything. They were burying Danny Rourke, 53 years old, road name, Diesel, 17 years with the club. He'd survived 2 stabbings, 1 crash that should have killed him, and a federal investigation that took down men twice as careful as him. What got him in the end was his heart, quiet, ordinary, almost insulting for a man like Danny. The cemetery was outside of town, an older place, oak trees thick enough to block the sky. The procession had come in loud, the way it always did. 30 bikes minimum, engines cutting off one by one until the only sound was wind moving through leaves and the low murmur of men who didn't know what to do with grief except stand close together. The chaplain spoke. The flag, not the American one but the club colors, was folded. A woman cried somewhere to the left. And then one of the members, a man they called Reaper, 6'4", arms like bridge cable, a beard that had gone gray before its time, glanced toward the tree line. There was a boy standing there. Maybe 8 years old, maybe 9, hard to tell from a distance. He was wearing a dark jacket that was a size too big, jeans with a tear at the left knee, and sneakers that had seen better years. He stood very still, hands at his sides, not fidgeting the way kids fidget. Just watching. Reaper looked away, figured it was someone's kid gone wandering. He looked back 2 minutes later. The boy hadn't moved an inch. After the service, when the crowd thinned and the bike started again, Reaper scanned the tree line one more time. The boy was gone. He didn't think about it again, not for a while. 6 weeks later, they buried Marcus Webb, road name, Wrench. Complications from a surgery he'd put off too long, the kind of stubbornness that costs men their lives slowly, quietly, without drama. Different cemetery, smaller crowd, colder day. Same boy. This time he was standing near the far end of the fence line. Same posture, same stillness, same dark jacket, though this time he had a gray wool cap pulled down over his ears. 2 members noticed him this time. Reaper again, and a man named Cord, younger, sharper-eyed, the kind of guy who cataloged everything and forgot nothing. "You see that kid?" Cord said quietly after the service. "Yeah," Reaper said. "He was at Danny's funeral." A pause. "You sure?" "I'm sure." Neither of them went to speak to him. The timing wasn't right. And there was something about the boy's posture, the way he held himself, that made approaching feel like it would break something, like interrupting a prayer. They rode out, they didn't forget. After the 3rd funeral, it was no longer a coincidence. After the 5th, it was a pattern. By the 7th, the whole club knew. No one had told them officially. It wasn't an announcement, wasn't a meeting agenda item. It spread the way truth spreads among men who pay attention, slowly, quietly, until everyone knows and no one can remember exactly how. He kept showing up. Different cemeteries, different weather, different times of year. Once in January when the ground was frozen and the wind cut like wire. Once in late spring when the flowers were aggressive and the sky was painfully blue. Once in August, in heat that made the leather coats look like a form of punishment. He was always there before they arrived, always positioned at a distance, near a tree line or behind a fence, or at the top of a gentle rise that gave him a clear view without putting him in the middle of anything. He never came closer, he never spoke. He never cried. That last part bothered people the most. Kids cry. Kids who somehow find themselves at the funeral of a stranger cry from sheer confusion, from the weight of the atmosphere, from the sound of grief in other people's voices. This boy didn't. He watched with an expression that wasn't sadness exactly. It was something older than sadness, something that had moved past the crying stage and settled into something quieter and more permanent. "He looks like he's paying respect," said a member named Dutch after the 8th funeral, "like he actually knew these guys." "He didn't," said Cord. "None of them knew a boy like that." "You checked." "I checked." Dutch looked out the window of the bar where they'd gathered after, the winter afternoon turning dark outside the glass. "Then who was he?" he said. Nobody had an answer. Let's be honest about what these men were. They weren't monsters, but they weren't angels either, regardless of the name. They were men who lived by a code that the outside world didn't always understand, and they'd earned their reputations the hard way, through years of writing, years of conflict, years of being exactly who they said they were without apology. They knew what it meant when something unexplained kept happening around them. Usually it meant someone was watching, gathering information, building a case or building leverage. Reaper was the one who said it plainly. Could be someone's using the kid. Law enforcement does it sometimes, puts eyes where nobody thinks to look. The table went quiet. "He's a child," someone said. "Children have parents," Reaper said, "and some of those parents would do a lot of things for the right deal." It wasn't a pleasant thought, but they were men who had learned not to dismiss unpleasant thoughts just because they were uncomfortable. Survival had taught them better. So they watched the boy the way the boy watched them. At the 9th funeral, a man named Sal, road name Bricks, gone at 61 from the kind of liver failure that tells a whole story by itself. They had positioned 2 members on the perimeter specifically to observe. The boy showed up 20 minutes before the service. He'd come on foot, apparently, appearing from a path between 2 rows of old elms. He carried nothing. He stood in his usual position, about 80 yards from the graveside. He stayed for the entire service, waited several minutes after the crowd began to leave. Then he walked back the way he came. Cord followed him at a distance. He followed him for half a mile before the boy got on a city bus, slipping in through the back doors as they were closing, exact change ready, like he'd done it 100 times. Cord watched the bus pull away. He caught a glimpse of the boy through the window, finding a seat near the back, staring forward. Alone. Always alone. It was Reaper who decided enough was enough. Not because he was the most suspicious. If anything, it was the opposite. Something had shifted in him over the months of watching. Some calculation had been running in the back of his mind, gathering data, and it had come back with a result that surprised him. The boy wasn't surveilling them. He was mourning. Reaper didn't know how he knew that. Couldn't have explained it in words that would satisfy a skeptic. But he'd been to enough funerals in the service, before the club, within the club, to know what grief looked like when it learned to stand still, when it stopped showing on the face and moved somewhere deeper. That boy was carrying something. The 10th funeral was for a member named Carl Bodie. Road name, Ghost, 64, cancer. He'd seen it coming for a year and handled it the way he handled everything, without making a fuss, without burdening anyone, without asking for more than he needed. It was a gray March day. The cemetery grass was still brown from winter. The sky was the color of old concrete. The boy was there, same spot roughly, same stillness. Reaper waited until the service ended and the crowd began to move toward the cars. Then he walked toward the tree line, steady pace, not rushing, not sneaking. The boy saw him coming. For a second, just a second, his posture changed. A tightening, the instinct to run maybe. But he didn't run. Reaper stopped about 10 feet away. He was a big man in a big coat, and he knew he looked like what he was. So he made himself smaller, somehow dropped his shoulders, put his hands where the boy could see them, kept his face as open as a face like his could manage. "Hey," he said. The boy looked at him. Not afraid, not exactly, more like someone who had decided they were ready for whatever came next. "You were at Danny Rourke's funeral," Reaper said. "October 2 years ago." The boy didn't respond. "And about 9 others since then." Still nothing. Reaper crouched down, slowly, the way you'd move around a dog you weren't sure about, so he wasn't towering over the kid anymore. "I'm not angry," he said. "I'm not going to call anybody. I just want to know who you are." The boy's jaw worked slightly, like he was deciding something. "Why?" he finally said. His voice was low, careful, but it wasn't a child's question. It wasn't reflexive suspicion or social fear. It was a real question. He actually wanted to know why it mattered. "Because," Reaper said, "you've been standing at the edge of our funerals for 3 years, and whatever reason you've got for being there, I think it matters." A long pause. Wind moved through the dead grass. Somewhere behind them, a motorcycle engine turned over. "My name is Jesse," the boy said. They didn't do it at the cemetery. Reaper walked Jesse to a diner 2 blocks from the bus stop, an old place with vinyl booths and coffee that had probably been on the burner too long. He bought the kid hot chocolate and a plate of eggs, and he sat across from him and waited. Jesse ate first, deliberately, like he was used to not turning down food when it was offered. Then he talked. His father's name was Ray Cortez. He'd been a biker, not with this club but a smaller one, regional, that had dissolved years ago after a federal crackdown scattered its members. Ray had been a mechanic mostly, a man who wore his patch with quiet pride, who tried to walk the line between the life and something more stable, and had never quite managed either one fully. He'd died when Jesse was 5. Not in a crash, not in a fight. A fire, a house fire on a Wednesday afternoon in November. Ray had gone back in for a neighbor's kid, a little girl, 3 years old, whose mother was screaming in the yard. He'd gotten the girl out. He didn't get himself out. Jesse remembered it in fragments the way 5-year-olds remember things. The smell, the sound of sirens, his mother's hands on his shoulders, the red and orange light on the window across the street. He'd asked about his father constantly after that. His mother tried to answer what she could, but there was so much she didn't know or didn't want to revisit. Ray had kept his 2 worlds separate, the way men like him often did. Jesse knew his father had brothers, knew there were men who'd mattered to him, who'd ridden with him, who'd been family in the way that words sometimes mean something different than blood. But he didn't know their names, didn't know their faces. When Jesse was 8, he'd started going to biker funerals. Not because he had some lead, not because he thought he'd find someone who knew his father specifically, but because he'd reasoned it out with a child's strange, determined logic. These were the funerals his father would have attended. These were the men who lived the life Ray had lived. If Ray had been here, he'd have stood among them. So Jesse stood among them instead. He was looking for something he couldn't fully name, proximity to something his father had been, evidence that the world his father believed in, the Brotherhood, the loyalty, the code, was real, that it hadn't died with Ray Cortez on a Wednesday in November. "My dad said," Jesse told Reaper, his voice very steady for a boy of 11, "that if anything ever happened to him, the kind of people he rode with wouldn't leave me without someone looking out." A pause. "He said I'd always be able to find that kind of people." He looked up from his hot chocolate. "So I've been looking." Reaper didn't say anything for a long time. He was not a man who cried. He'd learned that much young and reinforced it through decades of experiences that would have leveled softer men. He didn't cry at his own father's funeral. He didn't cry when he'd lost brothers, though he'd come close once in the dark of his garage, alone, where no one would know. He didn't cry now, but something in his chest moved, rearranged itself, made room for something it hadn't been holding before. "How long have you been coming to these?" he said. His voice was rough. He cleared his throat. "Since I was 8, Jesse said. So 3 years. Every one of them. Everyone I could find." He paused. "I look them up, obituaries, sometimes the local news. I take buses mostly. I've walked some." Reaper thought about that. An 8-year-old, then a 9-year-old, then 10, riding buses across town, sometimes out of town, to stand at the edge of the funerals of men he didn't know. For 3 years. In the rain, in the heat, in January with the ground frozen. Looking. Always looking. "Your mom know where you go?" "She works double shifts on weekends," Jesse said. Not defensive, just factual. "She's doing her best." "I know she is," Reaper said. He looked out the window. A truck rolled past. The day had gone from gray to darker gray. He thought about Danny Rourke, who died of a heart attack at 53 and never knew there was a boy standing at the tree line watching. He thought about Wrench and Bricks and Ghost. He thought about all of them. He thought about Ray Cortez, who'd run into a burning building for a neighbor's child and never come back out, and whose son had been riding buses across the city for 3 years, looking for the family his father had promised would be there. He pulled out his phone. "I need to make a call," he said. 2 days later, Jesse walked into a room full of bikers. His mother was with him. Reaper had spoken to her first, spent an hour on her front porch, standing the whole time because she hadn't invited him to sit, earning trust the slow way. He'd answered her questions. He'd let her ask hard ones. He'd told her the truth when he had it and said plainly when he didn't. She was a small woman with tired eyes and a spine like iron. She'd looked at him the whole time like she was measuring something. Then she'd said, "He's been going to those funerals since he was 8. I thought it was something he needed to do. Now I think I was right." A pause. "Don't make me regret this." "You won't," Reaper said. The room was a private one back of a rented hall, not the clubhouse, because Reaper had thought about it and decided neutral ground was right for this. About 15 members were there. Some of the older ones, a few of the younger, Cord, Dutch. A man named Pike who'd ridden with Ray Cortez briefly 20 years ago before the club split. Jesse walked in with his mother and stood in the center of the room and looked around at all of them without flinching. 15 large men in leather, and the boy looked at each of them in turn, calm as still water. "His name is Jesse Cortez," Reaper said. "His father was Ray Cortez. Some of you might know the name." Pike stepped forward. "I knew Ray," he said. His voice was quiet. "Good man, good mechanic, saved a little girl in a fire." He looked at Jesse. "That was your dad?" "Yes," Jesse said. Pike nodded slowly. Something settled in his face. "Your dad talked about you," he said. "Not much, he kept things separate way some men do, but he mentioned he had a son. Said he was going to teach him to ride when he was big enough. A beat. I'm sorry we weren't there. After the club split up and Ray was gone, I didn't know you existed, kid. I wish I had." Jesse looked at him for a long moment. "He said," Jesse started, then stopped, tried again. "He told me that the people he rode with, they don't leave their own behind." "They don't," Pike said. "He wasn't technically your member," Jesse said. Not accusing, curious, working something out. "So maybe I was confused about what that meant." "No," Pike said, "you weren't confused. They didn't adopt him. That's not a thing that works the way movies make it seem. What they did was more real than that, and in some ways more powerful. They went to see his mother again, several of them this time properly, with the kind of formality that showed respect. They sat in her living room and they talked about Ray. They told her stories she hadn't known, and she told them ones they hadn't known, and somewhere in the middle of that, the shape of a man came together more fully than any of them had held him before. They set up a fund, not a charity. They were careful about what they called it to make sure Jesse's school expenses were handled and that his mother didn't have to work quite as many double shifts. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't announced. It was just done. Pike became a regular presence. Not parental, he was clear about that, careful about overstepping, but available, a phone call, a visit, someone who'd known Ray and could answer questions as they arose because they would keep arising. Jesse was that kind of kid. And on a Saturday in May, about 3 weeks after that meeting, they held a ride. Not a funeral, a ride in the other direction, out to the open road, where the sky was high and blue and the land flattened out and the engine sang at full voice. Jesse rode on the back of Reaper's bike. Helmet 2 sizes too big, borrowed from someone's kid, his small hands gripping the bar behind him. His mother had said yes after a long pause and a look at Reaper that was equal parts trust and warning. They rode for 2 hours, 30 bikes, the whole sound of them together, that particular thunder that is like nothing else on earth. When they stopped at a roadside place for food and water, Jesse got off the bike and stood next to Reaper in the sun, and he looked down the long line of machines glittering in the afternoon light. Reaper looked down at him. "What do you think?" he said. Jesse was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said carefully, "I understand why my dad liked it." Reaper put a hand briefly on the boy's shoulder, just for a second. "Yeah," he said, "that's about right. There's a picture, nobody posed for it. Someone just had their phone out of the group at that roadside stop. 30 bikers and a boy. Jesse is standing in the front, still wearing the oversized helmet, pushed up on his forehead now so you can see his face. He's not smiling, exactly, but there's something in his expression that wasn't there before, something that had been absent for 3 years of standing at the edges of other people's grief. He looks like he belongs somewhere. For 3 years, Jesse Cortez had stood at funerals and watched. He'd honored men he didn't know because they represented something his father had believed in. He'd shown up in the rain and the cold and the burning August heat because his father had told him that loyalty meant something, that brotherhood was real, that the kind of people worth knowing don't leave their own behind. He'd tested that promise in the hardest possible way. And it had held. There's something we get wrong about strength. We think it's the hard exterior, the leather, the patches, the reputation, the look that makes strangers step aside. We think strength is the ability to feel nothing. But real strength is different. Real strength is a man like Reaper, who has seen enough hardness to last 10 lives, crouching down in a cemetery so a boy doesn't have to look up at him. Real strength is Pike saying, "I'm sorry we weren't there." Real strength is an 11-year-old who doesn't cry, who keeps showing up, who trusts a promise made by a man who isn't alive to keep it himself. Ray Cortez ran into a burning building for a child who wasn't his. His son spent 3 years looking for proof that his father's world was real. They both found what they were looking for. Blood makes you related. Loyalty makes you family. And some kids know the difference before any of us ever teach them.